All right, I'm in the Gospel of John. Gospel of John. I'm finishing up the book. Finally, it's been a long set of messages to get here. And so where I'm at right now is at the end of chapter 20. This is when John starts to bring closure to the letter that he wrote. All right, and so I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 30, he says, "And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." And at the end of chapter 21, he says, "And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." All right, so what John is saying is that he has made some decisions about what he would record about what Jesus did. And the decisions that he made was based on the purpose of wanting to encourage people to believe in Jesus so that they might have life. All right, and I will explain what that means again in a little bit. The idea of, well, what does that really mean, that you might have life in his name? I'll talk about that. Really, that is just the gospel itself and the restoration of the Holy Spirit. But what he says is that he chose certain things to record, and he decided not to record other things. Now, from what we can tell, this gospel, this letter that was written, was apparently written a little bit later in the historical record, a little bit later, considering the events that unfolded. And so what this means is that he probably had access to what was written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's a high probability that that's the case. And so if he had access, if he knew what Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote down, if he knew that, then he could decide not to record so much about what the other writers recorded, because that would just be redundant. Instead, he would spend some time writing about the things that were not recorded, which we have a number of things in his gospel that were not recorded in the other gospels. So we have an opportunity to see some additional things that Jesus did and some of the other events that took place. So we have an advantage with John if he did wait a little while because he could decide to write about other things and not overlap what the other writers decided to record. Okay, now from what we can also tell is that there were a number of things that John recorded that were significant to him. When he refers to the disciple whom Jesus loved, that appears to be him referring to himself, that he was the person who was present there. And so I described a number of things that John recorded that gave the indication that there were some personal dynamics that were going on that were very memorable to John. Okay, now, considering what he said here at the end of chapter 21, that there were a lot of things that could have been recorded, considering this, I think it's important to recognize two things. The first thing is that God was okay with engaging in the lives of all these people and only a few things being recorded, that he was okay with this. This tells us something about the character of our God, that he was doing a lot of the stuff that he was doing, not for the purpose of having things to say and things to do that would be remembered by you and I, all right? And by, people here in the future. That it wasn't just about that. It wasn't about you, that he was doing all of these things for future generations necessarily to remember, and that he was okay with this. This tells us something about the character of our God, that he was interacting with very few people who were only going to be alive for a short period of time. And of the people that he interacted with, only a few of those would genuinely believe and trust in him for who he really is. And so of those very few, of the few, those who would remain and who would find their place in the kingdom of heaven with him, these would be things that would only be remembered between God and these very few people. All right? This would be a personal experience between God and just a very few number of people. And I think this is really important to recognize about our God, that he has the kind of personality and he's the kind of person who would put out such tremendous effort and do so many important things, and only do this with a small handful of people, very few of which would ever really remember, with him in eternity. Now, of course, this does give them an opportunity to tell stories. We have lots of stories that we can tell and we can hear about when we go there. I mean, when I go to heaven, I do have the expectation that I will be able to interact with some of the people who were present at that time and ask them, tell me about the things that you experienced. What are some of these things that happened? I have an expectation that there will be an opportunity for that, and that I'll hear about these things. But I just wanted to show you, the first thing I wanted to show you, that there is a personal nature of our God, a very personal nature, in the sense that he really does desire, and he is very much okay with having personal interactions with a very few number of people, all right? And that this was between him and these people, all right? It wasn't about what is he going to do so that the rest of us in future generations would necessarily know about or even relate to whatsoever. The second thing is connected to that there were so many things that took place, and yet in the future generations, like the one that we have right now, these things have been, from the perspective of this earth, have been forgotten. Okay? I want you to consider that most of what Jesus did has been forgotten. Of those few people who even cared, they're gone. They're not here anymore. But that the things that Jesus did, they are not being remembered here in this world, on this earth. They have been forgotten. All right, and I want you to capture that and understand that. And see that our God is apparently relatively okay with that. That's fine with him. That those things that he did were somewhat forgotten. There's something else that I think that we can see about the character of our God, that a lot of those things that he did that were not recorded, of course, are going to be done not just for the people who were present, who experienced the benefits, and saw those things happen, but that these are things that God did because he wanted to. He did these things because he wanted to. And I'm sure he enjoyed doing these things. And he loved to do these kinds of things. And while those things have been forgotten, from our perspective, I'm sure that God himself, he remembers the things that he did and the interactions that he had and the relationships that he was able to experience with the people who he created. And that this is something that he probably enjoyed to a certain extent, at least, and he is okay with what happened. That this, to him, I'm sure, was good. And there's a lot that I think that we can learn about this from the perspective of ourselves as well. That when we go out personally and interact with the world that we're a part of, that we should recognize that most of what we're going to do is probably going to be forgotten, and that we should be okay with that. And while we will be able to remember a lot of the interactions that we have and the experiences that we've had, at a certain point, especially after you've lived many years, many of these things you yourself will tend to forget. You just won't remember so much. And that this is important to recognize, because sometimes, in our daily lives, we can become partially consumed with the issues related to the life that we are living, how much is being remembered, how much is being forgotten. We can be consumed with this kind of stuff, and it can get in the way of living our lives in the way that we really could, which could be better. It could be more peaceful, could be more enjoyable because of our concern with regards to what's going to be remembered or what isn't going to be remembered. And yet, we have the example of our God that, he only had a few things documented concerning his own life, and to him, he's just fine, that it's not about how can I get this relationship with the rest of the world so that the rest of the world will have this permanent record, this absolute documentation of me, and my existence and my life and all these things. There are people who are in some cases quite desperate to have this relationship with the rest of the world such that the rest of the world will recognize them and remember them, and not be able to live in as much peace as they could if they would just stop thinking about everybody else, and what everybody else thinks of them or what everybody else knows about them, and just live their lives, live your life and live your life in peace. There are many other things that you can do in your life that are very, very good and very wonderful, besides making sure that everybody in the world has proper documentation of you. So this is something that I think we should notice about the way that our God related to us and the way that I think he continues to relate to us. All right? That it's not just about everybody else, but it really is about him, and it is about our peaceful lives. Okay, so going back into verse 30 again, this is the end of John chapter 20 in verse 30. And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Okay, so John says why he documented, the relationship that he had with Jesus. Why he did that. He did that because he wants other people to have life in the name of Jesus. He didn't document all this stuff and so you'll remember John. It wasn't about that. It wasn't about him personally in that sense. He wanted other people to have life, which means that he wanted other people to be spiritually alive and to have a personal, interactive relationship with the living God, which of course would have, the opportunity for these people to have their own personal experiences with God, which of course John will never know about. He will never know about the impact of what he wrote, except for the word that gets brought to him in heaven. Things like that. But still, that's not the intent. That's not the purpose of why he wrote what he wrote. He didn't write it so that people would remember him and so that he would have this massive position, this relationship with everybody else. It was so that people would have a relationship with their God. He chose to write about those things and to document those things that would make a difference so that people would turn to God, not to him, but turn to their God. And so, what does it mean to have life in his name? Because most people, all right, even within the Christian world, have a really poor understanding of the gospel. The default, what people are going to think of is, all right, that we might have some kind of life here and today, in some abstract sense that has to do with us having peace, joy, and love, but they can never really describe that, quantify that, express that very well. It remains some form of hope, that you might. And then people live with this hope. One day I will have life in his name and I'll know what in the world that means. They just don't have that well described. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to describe that right now. That you might have life in his name is because you do not have life. All right? You don't. If you're not a born again believer, if you're not a child of God, then you're not alive. You're dead. And this is the gospel. The gospel is that our God has come into this world so that he came into this world so that people could be made alive, so that he could recreate the people who are born into this world, who are here on this earth. He could recreate them into a new creation. All right, now this, of course, is not how things got started. When he created mankind to begin with in the Garden of Eden, when he did that, he created Adam and Eve to be spiritually alive. They had the Spirit of God dwelling within them. He breathed within them the breath of life, and they became a living being. He gave them the law that if they ate from the wrong tree, if they were to eat from the wrong tree, then they would die in that day. And they did. It was a spiritual death that took place. Whereas the life of God, the Holy Spirit of God, withdrew from within them, responding to their rejection of him because they decided to believe the satanic lie that if they only knew what was good and evil, then they could be like God. That's what happened. So they believed the satanic lie. They rejected their God. God responded to their rejection and departed from within them, leaving them in a condition of being spiritually dead. And then everyone who was born from Adam and Eve were born spiritually dead, in the image of Adam, not in the image of God. And that has been the problem between God and humanity ever since. God had two issues to deal with. He had the issue of the knowledge of good and evil that has to be addressed, and that's related to the subject of sin, and he's got the issue related to spiritual death that needs to be dealt with. With regards to the knowledge of good and evil, we have a long, well-recorded history in the scriptures that describes the struggle of humanity of how do we live according to the knowledge of good and evil. If we know what's right and we know what's wrong, then can we live that way effectively? Are we going to live as God created us to live? Are we going to be like God? And we have a well-documented history of the failure of humanity to live up to those expectations. And of course, in the scriptures, we also have God's contribution to this effort, where he gave the Mosaic Law, which is the complete description from his point of view of the knowledge of good and evil. It's good enough so that people could know what they are to do and what they are not to do. And if they will just live that way, then, well, they're not going to. And so obviously they're not going to be like God. So this is a way of God addressing the question of, do we really live by the knowledge of good and evil? And in the midst of that, we also have a recognition that sin needs a resolution. And so God provided the resolution to the topic of sin by forgiving the sin. That's how he was able to deal with it. He just simply forgave it. And the way that he decided to execute this forgiveness was through living the life that he did as Jesus, and then eventually dying on the cross in the way that he did. And through all of that, that was his way of executing forgiveness for the sins of the entire world, and to be able to notify everyone that the sin issue was resolved between himself and humanity. But that's not the totality of the problem. We also have the spiritual death problem of humanity. So while he did die for the sins of the world, well, the world is obviously not saved. What you have is you have a lot of forgiven dead people on your hands. And being forgiven is nice, but if you're spiritually dead, well, you're still not going to have a place among the living. You have to be made spiritually alive. And so that's what the gospel is fundamentally about. It's about the invitation of God for you to receive his Spirit dwelling within you. And if you will respond to the truth that he has revealed concerning these issues, then he has promised that he will make you spiritually alive by coming to dwell within your spirit. There are many ways that people have been describing this, such as Jesus in your heart, stuff like that, which is fine. At least it's a good start when it comes to an understanding of this. But then you are made alive, and so that's what John fundamentally means in verse 31 here. In John chapter 20, verse 31, that you might have life in his name. That has to do with the restoration of the Holy Spirit of God, the life of God, that you might be made alive in his name, because of his name, because of who he is, and because of what he's done. That you would believe in him, in him as he is recognized in that name. All right? So that you may be made alive. You might have life. So to have life, first and foremost, it has to do with having the life of God, to be made spiritually alive. Now you've got a life. Now you're now made into a living person, and you've got a new life ahead of you to now live. All right, but now this leads us into the next chapter of chapter 21. All right, so now that you've been made spiritually alive, okay, now that you've been saved, now what? What does it mean to live? What does that mean? What does it mean to have life? How is that going to be experienced by us? All right, now a failure to answer this question well results in only one thing. It results in a person returning to the knowledge of good and evil, returning to a life of living by some form of law. Okay? That's what it usually means. It means, okay, well, now I got to live, so what do? Well, I find out what I should be doing, find out what I shouldn't be doing. I do those things that I should be doing. I don't do those things that I shouldn't be doing. What is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil. And that's what people default to when they have no idea what it means to be alive and to live in the life that they now have. All right? And this is what is mainly propagated and promoted. This is what's mainly presented and preached within the churches of Christianity. And it always has been. All right? For the most part, it always has been. And there's no shortage of leaders, of people who you can find who will then stand up and tell you about all the things you should be doing and shouldn't be doing, and that this is what it means to live the Christian life. That you might have life. That means that God was gracious and loving enough to tell us what to do and what not to do. And there is no shortage of this kind of stuff. There's no shortage of it at all. And the reason why it exists, of course, is because very few people understand what it means to be made alive and to have this life and to live their lives. There's very few people, and yet there are a majority of people who don't. And, there's a lot of support. There's a lot of financial support that will provide the facilities and the leadership and the infrastructure for people to participate in these kinds of things that most people will recognize when they think of the Christian world. And that's just what it is, But in the midst of that, there will always be some. It's always going to be few. It's always going to be a small percentage. But there will be some people who will move past these issues and will recognize that there is something else. There is something more. And, most of us who have encountered this had some time in what I would call the religious world. had some time in that before we realized that, this just doesn't seem right. This isn't working. There's something missing, and it's those very few people who not only see that, but through our desire for more will pursue the answers to these kinds of questions that we have when it comes to these things, because we really want to know the truth and we really want to know our God. All right, now what does it mean to live our lives if it's not going to be based on how we manage our flesh? It's if we're not going to indulge our flesh, we're going to restrain our flesh, but either way, it's still living by the flesh. If we're going to live in another way, well, what is that way? That way has to do with living with what we have. And what we have is an inheritance that has been given to us as a result of the death of the Messiah, that we now have, that we can enjoy and live with and apply to our daily lives right now and today. So there is a way to expand this into having life in his name now and in the way that most people are thinking. But it needs to start with having the life of God within us in his name. Then from there, because he is within us, there are some things that we have because we have him. For example, if he is dwelling within you, then you are accepted by your God. All right? You have his acceptance. You are accepted in the beloved. All right? This is a way of understanding that he accepts you. Okay, now chances are you have had an opportunity to encounter a lot of other people in the world, and you probably have noticed that they're not around you, and they might not even want you to be around them. This is a way of understanding that you are not accepted by these people. You're just not. I know this very well, that without question, the overwhelming majority of the people who I've interacted with do not accept me. I'm not acceptable. I'm just not. I'm not acceptable to the overwhelming majority of the people who I've encountered in my life existence. All right? There have been a few people who have been in my life in a way that they accepted me. A lot of people in my life who were in my life and did not accept me. But there have been a few. I probably, if I thought about it really hard, I could find a few who were in my life and they genuinely accepted me. All right. So what does this, what does this show you? This shows you that there is a tremendous lack of acceptance in the world. It's just the way it is for the most part. And that people will recognize that they have a need for acceptance, that there is a desire for acceptance. Now, there's obviously nothing wrong with wanting to be accepted. You should not feel bad about this. And, you shouldn't feel selfish or anything like that. This is part of your design. God designed you in a way that you would have a need to be accepted by someone else. It is a spiritual need that we have. All right? So the way that we will interact with other people will be a reflection of that. And it turns out that, people will do all kinds of strange and unusual and evil things in order to try to obtain the acceptance of somebody else. All right? And this is what a lot of people's lives involve, that their lives involve this a lot, is the pursuit of finding others who will accept them in one way or another, just some way, in some capacity of some kind, because they have a need for this. All right, and of course, there's a lot of sin that is committed in the pursuit of trying to obtain fulfillment for the need for acceptance. There's a lot of sin that ends up being committed as a result of that. All right, but if a person will rest in the acceptance that they have from their God, well, then they can be at peace, a little bit more than what they would be otherwise, to the extent that you're willing to rest in his acceptance for you. You can experience a sense of peace between you and your God. He will give this to you. And if you have his acceptance, the acceptance of a person who dwells within you, then this will change the way that you interact with the world that you're a part of. Your life will be a reflection of that. Your life will be different because of the peace that you will have in your own heart with the acceptance that you have from your God that has been given to you as a result of his death, which is described as part of the inheritance that you have received. All right, and so this is how I would describe having life in his name beyond just being made spiritually alive. That we might live our lives, what's left of them, as we're physically alive, we might live our lives with what our God has given to us. And that will be a quality of life, a type of life that we could not have in any other way. All right? There's no person who we could ever encounter who will accept us like our God will accept us. Our God loves us, and there's a great need that we have in our hearts to be loved. This is a spiritual need that our God created us to have. It is a good need to have. The challenge is how are we going to receive fulfillment for that need? Are we going to receive that from our God, or are we going to receive that through the world, through other people? And in order to obtain that, of course, we tend to engage in a tremendous amount of sin in order to feel as though somebody might love us, And in many cases, people will just lie and pretend that they do. And people can be okay with that. That's better than nothing for some. I can understand that. But that's not what our God created us for. That's not the kind of life that he has given to us. All right. Now, when you live for the restraint of the flesh, remember what I said earlier about the default, what people will default to if they don't understand the inheritance. What will they do? They will then live for the restraint of the flesh according to some system of law of some kind, either by taking some of the commandments out of the law that God gave, the ones that we find easier to obey, or listening to some religious leader tell us what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. We adopt the law of the church that we're a part of. Whatever people do, however people pursue that, there will always then be an opportunity for failure. And when you fail, all right, not if, when you fail, well, then obviously your God does not accept you. And he doesn't love you so much. All right, this is the message that gets communicated and well received, is that you're not so accepted by your God. You might be out of fellowship with him, or he might turn his back on you. That kind of stuff that people come up with. He's not going to bless you like he would have otherwise. This is what people believe, and they promote it as a way of trying to manage their own flesh and manage other people's flesh to try to get people under control through extortion and blackmail and all this other kind of dysfunctional stuff. But the end result is that you are not accepted by your God. You're not loved by your God. So now what? What do you got now? Is this supposedly now your incentive to get your flesh under control? This is what people would like to believe. And, well, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work out. And so people will live their lives without the acceptance of God and without the love of God as they genuinely need, which of course pushes them further and further into the world and into the indulgence of the flesh in order to get a break from all the pressure of the emptiness that's within them. And so by trying to live a life of indulging the flesh, that's obviously quite dysfunctional. To live your life for the restraint of the flesh, it's going to push you into living a life of indulging the flesh in other ways. as well. And so it just doesn't work. And it leaves people in a condition of not understanding what it means to have life in his name. And they're only left with some sense of hope that maybe one day, things will click. There will be revelation. There will be hope of some kind. There'll be something. This is what we end up with in many cases. But this is not what our God wants us to experience. He wants us to live our lives in peace. Peace in our hearts and peace with him. That we may live with him and engage our lives with him and be with him also in eternity in his kingdom when our physical lives finally come to an end. All right? Now, this is what happens. What happens is that people then, they don't know what to do, and so they pretty much do nothing, and then they just wait. They just wait until they die, or God returns. Okay? That's what it ends up like. And I can tell you, I've been in a lot of congregations of people who are just like that. That's what they're doing. They're waiting for Jesus to come back or physical death. And they're just waiting, and they've got no sense of peace at all. They're just hoping that one day something will, happen to them or something. And of course it doesn't. And then they die. All right? And that's kind of depressing, but it's what I've watched happen over the years. And it's just part of the way that people live. And, I'm not going to live that way, but that's what people will do. Okay, there you go. But this has a lot to do with what are the expectations that people have. What do you expect of God? What do you think of God? What do you know of him? And unfortunately, because of the lack of knowledge and understanding about who our God is as a person and what he's really done and what our condition is and what his provision is, because of the lack of understanding of these things, people just end up in these conditions of just waiting until they physically die and totally miss out on what they could have enjoyed in their lives while they were living. The disciples had a similar problem. All right? They had a similar problem because they had a belief that Jesus was the Messiah who was going to establish the messianic kingdom there in the land at that time. They believed that. And that, with the establishment of this kingdom, well then, of course, their lives are going to be different. Their lives are going to be different in various ways that they probably could talk about to some extent. But there was an expectation that there would be heaven here on earth, in that sense. And when Jesus died, that didn't happen. That just didn't happen. He did not come back, establish the messianic kingdom, throw the Romans out of the land, and cleanse the temple and reestablish the proper priesthood, that kind of stuff. He didn't do that. He didn't do any of that. So you've got the disciples who are just sitting around waiting, not knowing what to do. And I was describing this in the previous chapter, in chapter 20, that there they are hiding out in this room just waiting, and what are they going to do? Of course, they have reason to be concerned about their own physical safety, and I explained that in the previous messages. But still, you're going to see that there's this attitude of, well, we don't have the messianic kingdom. We thought he was the Messiah, so now what do we do? What are we going to do with our lives? And all they can really do is wait. Wait for what? Wait for God to come back and do something, right? Or wait until they're dead. It's the same thing as what's going on today. It's been going on ever since. People are just waiting around for either God to come back or for them to die. It's the same kind of thing. People are not necessarily waiting for the messianic kingdom. Some are, but it's still this idea of, okay, well, we're just going to wait, and we're not going to grow in our relationship with our God. We're not going to live our lives in this world. Now think about the disciples for a moment. If the Messianic kingdom was established, how would their lives really be different? I mean, really, how would their lives really be different? Okay, they wouldn't have the Romans in charge. Okay, well, what would be the first thing that they would notice from the Romans not being in charge? They would not be paying taxes to the Romans. Well, the taxes weren't really that high anyway, but not compared to what we experience today, not even close. But, okay, considering that they were a little bit of a burden, they would notice that they weren't paying taxes so much. Well, that's okay. Prices would go up because there's more money available. And so there's not necessarily going to be that much of a difference. There would be some difference, but really, that much? Would it make a difference concerning what they might do for a living? That's what people are usually thinking, is that when I mention that, they're usually thinking, well, I wouldn't have to do anything for a living anymore, wouldn't I? I mean, we'd have the Messiah, we'd have the Messianic kingdom, everything is now perfect. We're going to go back to something that's kind of like the Garden of Eden, whereas if you're hungry, you just go take the fruit off the tree. What are people thinking? Of course, you're still going to do things. Aren't you? Are you still going to do things? Are you going to produce more than what you consume, or not? So what really would be the difference of a person's life here in this world if Jesus returned? This is an abstract question and something to maybe make a note on and think about. What would their lives really be like if the Messianic kingdom was put in place? How would their lives really be different? Today, if Jesus was to come back today and he was to establish his kingdom today, how would our lives really be different? Well, there are some ways that we could say would definitely be different. There would not likely be as much war as we see happening right now. There wouldn't be as much of that. There would be some differences. But, considering many of these differences that would take place, would there really be that much of a difference concerning your own personal daily life? And this is just an open-ended kind of question of, how would your life really be different if that was to happen? And if he did come and bring an end to this earth, of course you're going to go into the kingdom of heaven, but there are many things that you would have missed out that you could have experienced, you would have missed out on, that you could have experienced here in this world, that would have given you opportunities to know your God as a person in ways that you won't be able to really capture and understand so much when you are in that different environment, different setting, with a different kind of dynamics and the different relationships. So, what would really be different? And I'm leaving that as an open question. For the disciples, I don't think there would have really been that much of a difference. Not necessarily. And in our own lives, if Jesus was to come back and he was to establish the kingdom and he was to eliminate all other countries and all their other kingdoms and he would rule and be in charge of the entire planet, how would that really make that much of a difference? Do we not still have a need for love and acceptance? Of course we would. We'd still have a need for that. Do we still need to eat? Do we still need clothing? Do we still need a place to dwell? Do we still need energy? Of course, these things are still going to be present. And so what would our lives really be different? How would they really be different? We would expect there would not be so much theft and corruption and crime and that kind of thing. We would expect that. We would hope for that, and maybe there could be a difference with regards to that. But I'm saying all of this in order to say that, yes, I understand that our lives could be a little different. And I don't want to say that it wouldn't be, because obviously it would. But it probably would not be that much different than how it is right now, which is to say that regardless of the fact that he's not here, regardless of that, you can still live your life. You may not have as much freedom as you would like to have, but do you have enough? You may not have as much peace as you would like to have, but can you find enough? And unfortunately, when people are so preoccupied with what they don't have, they never really consider and enjoy what they do have. It is as if they have nothing. It really can be like that. Okay, so having said all of that, let me proceed into the next chapter, into John chapter 21. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and in this way he showed himself. All right, starting from verse 2, he lists the 7 guys: Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. I think there were 7, maybe 8 guys here. I'm going fishing. Now, you've got all these guys gathered together, and then and what are they doing? They don't know what to do. Because everything that they had been doing the previous few years, the end result of that is not what they expected at all. So what are they going to do? Eventually, Peter just blurts out, I'm going fishing. I'm going fishing. That's what I'm going to do. There you go. And then what do the other guys say? Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we are going with you also. They went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. All right? They immediately they got up and just went into the boat. All right? Now I can just imagine that they're all sitting around looking at each other, not knowing what to do and not wanting to do anything because of fear, probably, of somebody saying, don't you have faith? Do you have a lack of faith or something? Or are we waiting for Jesus to come back? Right? And Peter says at first, he says, look, I'm just going to go fishing. That's it. And I can just imagine the other guys just having this great expression of relief. That finally somebody says something. Finally, we're going to go do something. Let's just get on with our lives. Let's just go fishing. All right, now they don't catch anything, and it's not recorded here, but I have the personal conviction that God intervened and kept the fish away. Maybe he sent a few angels, and they're down there under the water, telling the fish to go away or shooing the fish away, waving them off, making sure they don't come close to the nets. That kind of thing could very well have been happening. Something like that. But I do believe that this was some divine intervention to keep these guys from catching any fish. And I don't think it was a form of punishment of some kind because they had some lack of faith that they're not going to wait for Jesus anymore. I don't think that at all. I think that it has to do with the humor that's going to be presented shortly after this. Keep reading. In verse 4, but when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, children, have you any food? They answered him, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. All right? So at this time, God probably could very well have told the angels, okay, let's shoo the fish over to the boat, kind of thing. But that this was a miracle of God, a divine intervention, so that they would catch a bunch of fish, and it would be done with this kind of interaction, so that they would see as well that this was the Lord, and that they could enjoy the miracle and the humor behind what Jesus had just done. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Verse 7, therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved, which I believe is referring to John, said to Peter, it is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net of fish. Then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have just caught." All right, so we had Peter, who then saw that it was the Lord. So he's going to jump out of the boat. What does he do? He grabs his outer garment. Now, it would have been better to just leave that there, because that's going to slow him down in the water. What's he doing? There's the possibility that maybe he didn't want to leave evidence in the boat that he was in the boat. Maybe. I'm just suggesting that. Possibly. Could have been happening. Could have been something that he was thinking in his mind. I don't want to leave any evidence behind. Let me get all my stuff, everything, and then I'm going to exit the boat. So he exits the boat. He eventually makes it onto shore, and he's probably going to have a conversation with Jesus to some extent before the other guys come. And considering that Jesus encourages them to bring the fish, I would suggest that when Peter showed up, Jesus could have asked him, "Now, Peter, it's interesting that you jumped out of the boat and you came here to the beach so quickly to see me. But what about all the fish I just gave you? You just left all the fish back there. What are you thinking, really? Go get the fish, right?" I suspect that there may have been that kind of a conversation that nobody wanted to mention when the other guys came to shore that John maybe didn't know about. That's why, he may not have recorded it. These are some possibilities that I just can't help but think about when I see this happening. That first of all, Peter would not want to leave any evidence in the boat that he was there, and out of shame that he was not waiting for Jesus to return, and that when he got there to Jesus, Jesus would ask him, why didn't you bring the fish? And so Jesus has to mention this to the other guys. In verse 10, then Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have just caught." Verse 11, Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. Okay, so Peter goes and he gets the fish. All right, he goes and he gets the fish. And altogether, there were so many, the net was not broken. Jesus said to them, "Come and eat breakfast." Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. This is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So Jesus comes back, and they have breakfast together. They eat some bread, they eat some fish, and they have some conversation. That's what they do. It's the next day. That's what they do. You eat bread, you eat fish, or whatever else, and you have some conversation. And so what is Jesus encouraging them to do? To live their lives. To live their lives. That Jesus was not going to just show up, reorganize the political and religious infrastructure for them in some other way so that they would have peace and happiness because of that. But no, go ahead and live your lives. And that, of course, becomes a new discussion of what is that really going to mean? And that's the question that I've got for you, those of you who are using this for your small groups. I've got a question for you from all of this. What does it mean to you to live your life? All right? What does that mean? To live your life. Okay, first from the notion of that you might have life in his name, and then consider also the idea of living by the inheritance that you have received instead of living by the law that God gave. Live by the inheritance that he gave. And how would that be experienced as you would engage the life that you have? What would it really mean to you to live your life? And if you don't have an answer for how that looks today, well, How would you like that to look? What would you want that to look like? And if you can consider what you would want it to look like, then maybe you could make some changes and some adjustments so that you would get closer to the kind of definition of what you think it would mean to live your life. And of course, make adjustments later, but at least it moves you in a different direction perhaps than the kind of direction that you are living in right now. Okay, but I want you to see that this is what Jesus does. He doesn't come back and then conquer the land. He doesn't come back for that. He comes back and he sits around a campfire and has some food and has some conversation. What's wrong with that? This is good, right? This is good. So this is where I'm going to pause, and then I'll go into the conversation in the next message. The next message is going to be the last one in this series for the Gospel of John. But there's a lot that we can see in this conversation that Jesus has, especially with Peter, about the kinds of things that he would like us to add to our lives that would describe what it means to live our lives. Okay, thank you. I'll continue with this in the next message.